Over the next 12 weeks, we're going to be focusing on answering two big and important questions. First, how do environmental factors shape human security? And second, what are the direct and indirect means by which environmental factors affect violent political conflicts? Those kind of conflicts are what I focus on in my research on a day to day basis. I thought I would start by a few examples of the kind of puzzles we're going to be focusing on, the kind of environmental, human, and conflict types we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester. So let's start with a few examples. The first is an aerial shot of Tikal, Guatemala. Why did the Maya, the people who lived there 600 years ago, who had a remarkably sophisticated civilization of over 19 million people, suddenly collapse sometime during the 8th or 9th century AD? Evidence suggests deforestation and drought, basic security of the basic needs needed to survive, so people ended up having to migrate to other areas to start anew. We're going to be talking more about deforestation and environmental change in week 4 and more about droughts in week 7. The next example is from the first Iraq War back in 1991. Why did the Iraqi army invade a sovereign country next door, Kuwait, in late 1990? And why, given the pushback and the ultimatums given by the international community, did the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, not back down? The causes of political instability we're going to be talking a bit about later on today and in week 3. Next example is of artisanal gold mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2015. Why in this day and age are people still using their hands, buckets, and other tools to dig precious metals and gemstones in some of the poorest and most conflict-ridden areas of the world? Those of you who have cell phones, including, of course, me, are part of that global demand for raw minerals. We, of course, in Australia benefit from resource extraction in Australia because the global commodities markets help prop up our tax base, but also us as consumers because it allows us to purchase things that we use now on a day-to-day basis. We're going to be talking more about natural resources in week 9, focusing both, of course, on the DRC as well as in other areas of natural resource extraction, what effect that has on human security and conflict. Next topic that I think viscerally captures the kind of climate challenges we're looking at in this class is the desertification of the Sahel. It is an area of the world that's changing as fast as any due to climate change. The desert that stretches across the entire continent of Africa in the north is growing on a day-by-day basis. Changes in rainfall and human activity is having a huge effect on the land. A lot of the human activity is just trying to survive or part of large infrastructure projects to be able to adapt and shift the availability of water and other resources for their benefits. We're going to be looking at dams in Mali and in Ethiopia and other efforts to try to address the desertification of this region. These changes have had an effect on conflict. In week 8, we're going to be looking at clashes between pastoralists and agriculturalists due to the desertification of the Sahel, and we're going to be looking at food production and consumption in week 8 as well. This boat is thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean. The Aral Sea, part of which has dried out and left these kind of fishing boats stranded, is an example of policymaking shifting the very environment of the areas in which the policy making can affect, leading to health disasters, environmental disasters, and the possibility of humanity both engaging environmental change and then potentially learning from it and being able to reverse it. We're going to be talking about desertification in week 7, as well as looking at more detail the Aral Sea specifically, and Central Asian water, food production, and desertification. Of course, too much water could also be an issue as well. Dhaka in Bangladesh, as well as other parts of the world, are becoming more difficult to live in because of the challenge of having too much water, whether it's predictable or not. Flooding is common in Bangladesh, but is also becoming increasingly common in other parts of the world, whether it's New York City after Hurricane Sandy, storm surge there, Venice, Italy. They've had to try to spend a large amount of money to hold back rising seas. I spent 4 years living in New Orleans. I know all too well how much the land is being is disappearing because of rising ocean levels. Next example is water that can all of a sudden show up in which it wasn't there before. The 2004 tsunami that killed over 200,000 people on Christmas Day back in 2004 is a dramatic example of that, although you also see how the tsunami in Japan that led to the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown is also had an effect with both earthquakes as well as sea level rise. We're going to be talking more about natural disasters and the effect of tsunamis on conflict in week 10, and how in the example of Aceh specifically, a natural disaster ended up making conflict less likely rather than more likely. Most people think that natural disasters can make conflict more likely. Is an example in which natural disaster actually brought both sides together in a negotiated settlement that is still more or less surviving over a decade later. Another topic we're going to be covering is population characteristics, where people are, what they do, and what happens when they try to move place to place. This Syrian crisis has fallen out of the headlines in recent years, but the refugee flows from Syria and other conflict zones have created widespread challenges in neighboring countries as well as farther afield. And we're going to be looking at later on in week 6 about what it means to be a refugee. So in this picture, you see a father carrying his child over an international border between Syria and Jordan. And what makes this dramatic is because people have different rights in international law, whether they're on one side of the fence or on the other side. That being a refugee requires you to actually cross an international border. And so we're going to look at how migration interacts with environmental, economic, and political factors. Other types of environmental issues that create policymaking changes linked to climate change would be sea loss due to rising temperatures. This is a graph of the growth of Arctic sea loss seasonally in the northern part of the world. It is one of the most dramatic structural realities of the changing world in which we live in. This sea loss has occurred just within your lifetimes. A lot more has happened within my lifetime. We're going to be talking in week 12 about the Arctic Council international efforts to try to coordinate collective action to be able to address the Arctic sea loss, as well as the challenges and opportunities that faces for security as resources become available that weren't available before when there was ice over it, and the challenges to international cooperation when the stakes are so high. Just a picture here of the Beaufort Sea north of Alaska and the Yukon in the Arctic. You have large swaths of territory that had been covered with solid ice now melting. that the surface melts on these on the surface of the ice, that decreases the amount of light that's reflected off the ice and actually can speed up Arctic melting. Greenland, on the other side of the Arctic, its sea loss is one of the best measured. A recent paper that just came out shows that the ice loss has accelerated from 25 billion tons per year in the 1990s to 234 billion tons today. So it's a almost tenfold increase just in 2 decades. On the other side of the world, the Arctic and the Antarctic continent is also dealing with sea ice loss that is going to have an effect on the rest of the world. Scientists are keeping an eye on the Thwaites Glacier in particular, that could cause a dramatic sea level rise just by this one ice sheet breaking off and melting. I included a link in the notes to a visualization of the recent ice loss in the Thwaites Glacier, and you can see it also in other parts of Antarctica. This sort of sea level rise, you see people talk about low-lying areas like Bangladesh or Vietnam, but as we're going to see later on this semester, including week 11 for Australia, sea level rise also can affect a lot of coastal areas within Australia, because a lot of people do live close to the coast here, of course. Just to look at a couple of regions of where the most exposed people are to sea level rise, specifically just zooming across a couple different regions. The takeaway is that this change is having an effect regardless of the region we look at, whether it's Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Bangladesh, as I talked about before, East Asia generally, and Vietnam, especially down in the south with the Mekong Delta. You see a huge effect of the number of people that are going to be affected by sea level rise. And it's difficult when you look at these kind of topics. I want to recognize this from the outset, that that when you look at the change, what's happening now and what's likely to happen in the future, a lot of the research we're going to be looking at in this class is trying to extrapolate from where we are now to what's likely going to happen in the future. Is conflict going to become worse? Are humans going to find it harder to survive in certain areas, or find new opportunities in others? And when I think about the evidence that we're going to be touching on over the course of the semester, the readings we're going to look at, these topics can make you feel like either Cassandra or Chicken Little. I don't know, again, one of those analogies. Cassandra was, in Greek mythology, a cursed princess, that she could see the future and she could tell other people, but no one would ever be able to believe her promises. More recently, Chicken Little, I don't know if you ever saw this movie back when you were a kid, but it's based on a European folktale, Henny Penny, a number of different instances of it, of a chicken who believed that the world was going to end and would run around saying that the sky is falling. And the scientists who study this day to day, it does have an effect on, right? There's been increasing amount of research on and surveys on the effect that it has both on researchers as well as us as citizens, knowing the trends, as the science has been clear for decades, right? And so this article I linked to, the Mother Jones article, talked about the burdens of being a climate scientist, and I included a number of links of a number of different articles that said whether the situation that we're living in now with COVID-19 is whether that's going to be able to shift the larger dynamics, the flows that we're going to be looking at over the course of the semester. There's been some recent studies about the effect of all of us stopping moving has had. The sensors that monitor earthquakes and human activity has noticed a significant drop of people that stayed close to home. But a lot of the things that we've looked at, that we're going to look at over the course of the semester, are not necessarily new or not studied. Back when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I was reading about the environment and humans' effects on it. I saw Bill Clinton and Al Gore give speeches right before one of the debates. Al Gore wrote Earth in the Balance, a book that drew attention to the need for climate action. Earth Day goes back a couple of decades before that, right? Some some things have changed. Economic international cooperation with chlorofluorocarbons and others shows that cooperation is possible. Human behavior has definitely changed over the last couple decades. Some have not. Before COVID-19 pretty much knocked everything else off the headlines over the last couple months. The last time I taught this class, Extinction Rebellion shut down classes for a couple of weeks. There was increasing awareness of climate action. There was a Swedish climate activist, 16-year-old climate activist from Sweden who sailed across the ocean, gave a speech at the United Nations during their climate summit. That the realization of these factors that we're going to be talking a lot about this semester was real. It has kind of skipped off the pages, but I think it's going to come back before too long. And I think it's worth taking a minute to look at Greta Thunberg's speech at the Climate Action Summit, both as a visceral reminder of some of the issues we're going to be talking about this semester, specifically those who gain the benefits from economic production or the status quo are not necessarily those who pay the costs. The poor are more likely to pay the cost no matter what area we're actually looking at. Various types of actors, some are predictable, some are not, play different roles in changing the system and behavior. I don't think that many people would have predicted a 16-year-old Swedish student engaging in a protest and not going to school would end up having that effect. Different people play roles in different systems of behavior. I think she's an example of the difficulty and a lot of the topics we're going to be talking about, the difficulty of collective action in the face of these kind of larger challenges, and the fact that there are changes, punctuated equilibria, right? Whether COVID-19 and these couple months that we're living through now could shift the world to a different level of awareness of the possibility for coordinated activity, or for the usefulness of research on some of these different topics remains to be seen. But let's take a look at Greta Thunberg's video, and the question that I want you to think about is what change at the end of the video you think she's referring to. I've left a note on Waddle for you to be able to respond. I really am interested to think you can interpret her video and the change that she talks about in two, maybe more, two ways at least. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Put them in the Waddle quiz question. It's not being marked, but more just to try to get you to think about the videos that we're actually looking at and to get your perspective, so that this is not just me talking to a camera, but getting more of this discussion that we can carry on into the workshop.